Last week, I was sitting in a sun-drenched bistro in Brussels, just a stone's throw from the European Commission. At the table next to me, there was a group of mid-level bureaucrats, and they were clinking glasses, their faces flushed with this sort of triumphant, giddy glow. They were celebrating the final rollout of a massive new regulatory package, a landmark framework for digital ethics. One of them, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, he kept leaning in and his eyes were bright with this almost religious intensity. He wasn't talking about innovation or, prosperity. He was talking about compliance. He whispered, "We've finally fenced them in." It sounded less like a public servant and more like a hunter who just bagged some rare trophy. No one moves in this sector now without our stamp of approval. To him, this mountain of paperwork was a masterpiece of civilizational progress. He felt this deep down satisfaction that Europe was finally asserting its values over the chaos of the market. But when I gently asked him if he'd seen the morning's macro data, the reports showing another quarter of stagnant 1% growth and the silent exodus of the continent's brightest AI engineers to Singapore and Austin, his expression didn't even flicker. He just pulled out his phone and showed me this polished infographic from an internal memo. He said, "Look at these compliance metrics," as if the number of forms filed was a more valid reality than the fact that the industry itself was, evaporating. But then the atmosphere shifted. A waiter accidentally dropped a tray nearby, and for just a split second, that mask of administrative confidence cracked. The bureaucrat didn't look annoyed. He looked genuinely frightened by the sudden, unscripted noise. He immediately started complaining about how unpredictable and volatile the public was becoming, and even muttered this bizarre line about how the ungrateful productive sectors were sabotaging the social contract. That instantaneous shift from the intoxicated joy of wielding regulatory power to this visceral, defensive fear of the world outside his bubble, it was haunting. It wasn't just a disagreement over policy. It felt like watching a doctor celebrate a perfectly executed surgery while the patient was already cold on the table. It made me realize that what we are seeing in 2026 isn't a string of bad luck or a temporary downturn. It is a clinical engineered implosion, a managerial revolution that has successfully captured the machinery of a continent only to realize it has no idea how to keep the engine running.
Wow, that image it's potent, because it perfectly illustrates the structural impact of this European managerial class. Their whole focus is on regulatory triumph, and it's completely disconnected from, technological sovereignty or any real-world economic output.
It felt completely unreal.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to look at the structural reasons why that disconnect happens. We're examining these frameworks that are designed to correct so-called economic market failures, but they almost always fall victim to even deeper failures of government and political inertia.
Comparing the U.S. and the EU approach.
Exactly. We're comparing both.
Okay, so our mission today is ambitious. We need to analyze these regulatory systems, how they try to fix these suboptimal market outcomes, and then explore a serious proposed third path for how we can rationalize government intervention.
A new way forward.
Right, and we're drawing heavily on some of the structural innovations from the European model, trying to look beyond the current, economic malaise to find ways to build a more dynamic and less rigid regulatory approach, specifically for the United States.
And hopefully we're looking for an institutional design that prevents that clinical implosion you just witnessed.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the American machinery. The U.S. regulatory system is so often criticized for being bogged down. It seems like it's unable to start new programs when they're needed and completely unable to kill old ones when they become obsolete. What's the root cause of this policy paralysis?
Well, at its core, it's a persistent political market failure. And it's driven by a really fundamental ideological conflict. You have these two massive, usually antagonistic forces operating at the same time.
The conservatives versus the progressives.
Right. On the conservative side, the prevailing argument is that strong regulation actively stifles economic growth. They point to the stagnant European economies as this big cautionary tale of what they call sclerotic socialism.
So for them, the goal is always to constrain the federal regulatory leviathan.
Always. Conversely, progressives look at economic crises, the 2008 financial collapse or widening inequality, and they blame large financial firms, they blame corporations. Their solution,
or regulate,
greatly expanded regulation. They insist the state has to curb what they see as the endless depredations of industry to protect the vulnerable.
And any rational policymaker, someone just trying to draft an evidence-based solution, they're just stuck completely in the middle.
They're paralyzed. And this creates a dynamic of partisan gridlock And, this is the crucial part, regulatory inertia.
Inertia.
Yes. So on the defensive side, conservatives instinctively refuse to authorize any new regulatory programs because history shows these things become almost impossible to reverse. They're terrified of this irreversible march toward bigger government.
And on the progressive side,
they become these entrenched defenders of every existing market intervention. It doesn't matter how inefficient or outdated it is, because validating any criticism of current regulation, well, that just gives political ammunition to the anti-regulatory narrative.
the result is policy concrete. Good regulation can't get off the ground, and outdated bad regulation just can't be sunsetted.
Exactly. But that inertia, it's not just political, it's institutional. It actually stems from Congress itself.
Okay, so let's get into that. The institutional limitations of Congress.
Right. So the primary issue is what you'd call the expertise gap. Congress as a whole is a political body, right? It's not a technical one. It generally lacks the deep, specialized institutional expertise in fields like, advanced economics, material science, cutting-edge tech.
All the things you need to actually understand a modern market failure.
Precisely. Congress can pass a law that says, thou shalt reduce carbon emissions by X%. That's a broad goal. But they struggle profoundly to design narrowly tailored legislative responses.
To specify how industry should do it without causing massive disruption.
Exactly. And they certainly don't have the institutional agility to readjust that legislation 5 years later when new technologies have completely changed the game.
It really feels like they're just outsourcing the core function of governance because they aren't technically equipped to handle it themselves.
That outsourcing is pretty much inevitable, given how complex the modern economy is. But this structural weakness is then ruthlessly exploited by the lobbying dynamic, which is a phenomenon that public choice theorists have documented really well.
And their argument is basically that because gathering and processing complex data is expensive, only the people with the most resources can really participate in that political market.
That's it. So who pays for that expense?
The wealthy and the organized.
The wealthy and the organized. Special interests figure out they don't need to lobby the entire massive federal apparatus. They only need to target key, influential members of the relevant congressional committees.
And the unelected federal bureaucrats.
And the unelected federal bureaucrats within the administrative agencies that have direct jurisdiction over their sector. The cost of compiling influential, detailed technical information, the kind that actually sways the specific wording of a regulation, is prohibitive for the average citizen or a small competitor.
So it naturally favors wealthy campaign donors and these highly organized interests. It's that old story of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs.
That's the perfect way to put it.
The public pays a tiny cost spread across millions of people for a bad regulation, but a single corporation gets a massive, concentrated benefit from a tailored loophole, so it becomes totally worthwhile for them to spend millions on lobbying.
Precisely. So even though Congress lacks the expertise, the administrative agencies, the EPA, the SEC, the FDA, they're better staffed. They have the economists, the scientists, the lawyers.
Right. And we said they're legally bound by things like Executive Order 12,866, which mandates a formal cost-benefit analysis for any significant regulatory action. So they have the experts and the rules. Why do we still end up with these flaws?
It's because of the significant interstices, or you could just say gaps, in those economic analysis requirements. EO 12,866 provides a starting point, but the procedures don't mandate the level of rigor or, continuous reassessment that you'd need for long-term efficiency.
So the regulations they create are maybe okay at the start, but they get outdated fast.
They're often suboptimal initially, and critically, they become increasingly outmoded and, not infrequently, counterproductive over time. The agency might have the specialists, but they often lack the statutory authority, and they certainly lack the political will to go back and carefully reassess and tailor decades-old programs to respond to changing market forces.
And this leads us directly into that concept of regulatory ossification, the regulatory lock-in problem. This is where the initial intent of a regulation gets completely twisted to serve the very industry it was supposed to regulate.
It's one of the most insidious failures of governance. Let's use that detailed example from our sources. Imagine a law is passed that requires all factories to install a specific, expensive pollution abatement filter. At the time, it's the best available technology.
Okay. The industry complains, but they comply. They sink millions into installation and maintenance.
Exactly. Now, fast forward 10 years. Market forces and technological innovation have created entirely new, clean production methods that completely eliminate the need for that filter.
So Congress could just repeal the outdated mandate.
Could, but partisan inertia prevents them from doing so.
But here's the part that's so counterintuitive. Why does the industry that already paid for the filter suddenly lobby to keep the burdensome statute? They're literally paying for something they don't need anymore.
It's a purely anti-competitive strategy. Because they have already incurred the massive sunk costs of installing and maintaining that obsolete filter, the continued existence of the mandate acts as a massive barrier to entry for any new, smaller competitors.
Of course.
A startup might have access to the new, cleaner technology that costs far less. But because the regulation still mandates the outdated, expensive filter, that startup has to raise prohibitively high capital just to comply with the totally unnecessary rule.
So the incumbent firms successfully weaponized the regulation they initially complained about to preserve their own market concentration.
That is crony capitalism distilled. Regulations, no matter how well-intentioned, evolving into these permanent, irrevocable constraints that protect the large and entrenched players from dynamic market forces. This is the ultimate institutional outcome of policy rigidity.
That lock-in problem is just a perfect illustration of political market failure. But we should probably zoom out for a moment. The entire justification for government intervention in the first place is the existence of an economic market failure. Before we talk more about fixing the political problem, let's quickly refresh ourselves on what the regulations are supposed to be fixing. What are those 4 classic market dynamics that regulation targets?
Right. The underlying premise is that a pure laissez-faire economy, while it's generally efficient, might not always produce the optimal outcomes for, maximum net social utility. These intervention points traditionally fall into 4 categories.
Okay, what's number 1?
First up is monopoly power. This is your classic trust-busting scenario. It happens when a few major firms dominate a specific economic segment.
Their market share gets so large, they can basically set prices however they want.
Pretty much. They risk setting prices beyond the levels that could be justified purely by supply and demand, and that leads to deadweight loss for consumers. So regulation intervenes here to ensure competition and prevent too much concentration.
Okay, second is externalities. This is the pollution example we just talked about, but it's broader than just environmental stuff.
Oh, absolutely. An externality exists whenever firms or individuals don't internalize all the costs or benefits of their actions, their costs or benefits, that just spill over onto a third party.
So the classic negative example is industrial pollution that leads to, say, endangered species habitat loss.
Exactly. The company's financial ledger doesn't account for the loss of biodiversity or the cost of cleaning up public waterways. Prevailing market forces actually incentivize the firm to continue this activity, even though it imposes a net, uncounted cost on all of society.
The third is public goods. This often relates to things like national defense or lighthouses, but it also applies to information itself.
Correct. Public goods refer to situations where the individual benefits of exploiting a good exceed the individual costs of exploitation. Think about intellectual property. If there's no protection, no regulation, everyone can benefit individually from an idea at almost no cost.
But the social cost is huge. No one has the incentive to invest the time and capital and risk to produce those breakthrough ideas in the first place.
Right. So regulation, like patent and copyright law, steps in to convert these public goods into quasi-private goods just to stimulate their production.
And finally, number 4, information asymmetries.
This one breaks the classical economic assumption of perfect information. It just means one set of actors consistently has superior, relevant information compared to another set of actors.
The famous lemon problem with used cars. The seller knows if it's a good car or a lemon, but the buyer has no idea.
That's the one. So regulation, like mandatory disclosure laws or standardizing labels or securities laws for financial markets, aims to bridge that information gap so that prices can accurately reflect quality.
So if the economics community pretty much agrees on these 4 dynamics as legitimate reasons for intervention, why is designing the fix so unbelievably difficult? This gets us into what the sources call the difficult determinations.
Yes. Diagnosing the failure is the easy part. Designing a rational fix is nearly impossible. The first difficulty is the cost-benefit modeling challenge. To choose the optimal regulation, you need so much more than just predicting the future impact of the regulation you want to impose.
You have to model what would have happened without it.
Exactly. You need this exceedingly difficult economic modeling that forecasts counterfactual scenarios. You have to ask, What would the economic fortunes of this industry or this specific firm look like if it had a radically different regulatory environment or no intervention at all?
You're building a shadow economy in your analysis.
You're essentially modeling multiple universes. And it is extraordinarily hard to establish that counterfactual baseline with any confidence, even with the most advanced econometric models.
And even if you pull that off, the benefit side of the equation is still just stubbornly abstract.
That's the second challenge, quantifying abstract benefits. It's exceptionally hard to affix a monetary value to benefits like, say, preserving the habitat of an endangered species, or achieving broader social justice goals, or ensuring human dignity in digital spaces.
Which is exactly what that Brussels bureaucrat was celebrating.
Right. And while these benefits are universally appealing, noble policy objectives, economics really struggles to translate them into a concrete dollar figure that can be reliably weighed against compliance costs on a balance sheet. Without that dollar figure, the entire cost-benefit analysis becomes subjective and, frankly, easily manipulated.
Okay, so policymakers have modeled the cost, they've modeled the counterfactual world, but they still have this big qualitative moral question mark on the benefit side. How in the world do they then choose the optimal intervention?
And that's the third difficulty. Choosing the optimal intervention.
Yeah.
Once the failure is diagnosed and the costs and benefits are estimated, policymakers have to decide on the scope and the style of the intervention. And they're often stuck deciding between interventions that maximize net economic benefits versus those that minimize disruption to the underlying market.
Give me an example of that.
Let's stick with the pollution example.
Right.
They could opt for a highly rigid command and control solution mandating a specific, expensive technology that eliminates almost all noxious emissions.
Okay, that sounds like it would have huge benefits.
It might. And if the projected environmental benefits are immense and the compliance costs are small, this maximizes net benefits. But what if the factories in that sector operate on very low profit margins? This prescriptive solution could be unnecessarily disruptive, maybe causing mass bankruptcies and job losses.
So the intervention, while achieving a net positive environmental outcome, might create a net social negative because of the disruption.
Exactly. The alternative might be a system of tradable permits, a cap-and-trade system. This approach might generate slightly smaller net environmental benefits because it allows for some limited pollution based on the permit cap.
But it's way less disruptive.
Far less disruptive to the underlying market forces because it gives industry maximum flexibility in how they achieve compliance. It lets the market decide where the cheapest pollution reductions can be found. The optimal choice, therefore, isn't just the one that achieves the highest net economic benefit on paper.
It's the one that ensures the means are proportionate to the problem and respect the health of the functioning parts of the market.
And that tension between maximizing benefits and minimizing disruption brings us right back to Europe. It's really ironic, that we are turning to the EU for structural regulatory insights, given the common conservative critique that the entire continent is trapped in the stasis of sclerotic socialism.
It does seem strange.
But the key takeaway here is that the EU system was designed much later than the U.S. Administrative Procedure Act, the APA. Its architects had the benefit of observing decades of U.S. regulatory failure, and that led to some crucial institutional innovations.
They got to learn from our mistakes then. So what's the first key strength, the one that makes cost-benefit analysis so pervasive over there?
The first strength is the pervasive application of cost-benefit analysis, CBA, and the formal consideration of risk trade-offs. Now, while the EU CBA standards can sometimes be a bit vague in execution, they can lack the rigorous quantitative analytical requirements we sometimes demand in the US. The system mandates CBA far more comprehensively across various agencies and sectors.
And why is that comprehensiveness so vital?
It's because of the loss of scarcity. We just have to recognize that every resource allocated by regulation is finite. CBA is essential for both efficiency and fairness, acknowledging that the costs of overregulation are not just paperwork. They consist of foregone earnings, delayed innovations, and fundamentally societal resources, money, time, talent, diverted from potentially more productive uses.
This is where that risk concept comes in, right?
Yeah.
It helps put a boundary on regulatory ambition.
Precisely. The risk trade-off concept acknowledges that if you dedicate excessive resources to minimizing one very narrow risk, say a specific environmental contaminant in a local river, that almost certainly leads to a net reduction in overall societal well-being.
Why?
because those resources could have been used to minimize other, potentially much greater, risks elsewhere, like improving road safety or increasing public health screening or funding basic medical research.
It's like a family budget. If you spend 80% of your safety budget securing your attic against a 1 in 500 year flood, you have nothing left for, annual medical checkups or fixing the faulty wiring that's an immediate fire risk.
That's the risk trade-off in real life.
Yeah.
That's a perfect analogy.
I can see how politically this is a really difficult conversation to have. It feels a bit cynical, or as the source material noted, misanthropic, to focus on costs when you're talking about things like safety or environmental preservation.
It feels uncomfortable, for sure.
Yeah.
But some form of CBA is just non-negotiable because scarcity is a reality. Regulators love to use this soaring, transcendental language calling for wholesome food or absolute safety, but the dismal science of economics has to deflate those ambitions into achievable, rational objectives.
The source material notes that regulators who pursue these expansive goals, blithely unaware of the scope of the economic dislocations they may create, are actually doing a disservice.
Exactly. Furnishing more information, even if it seems petty, leads to more sophisticated, less disruptive decision-making in the long run.
Okay, now let's move to the second innovation, which addresses that disruption problem head-on, the proportionality principle. This concept feels very European.
It is. It's a core tenet of EU governance, and it's outlined in Protocol number 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It requires simply that the means employed to achieve an objective do not go beyond what is necessary.
And European courts actually treat this as a substantive check.
They do. They assess whether the chosen method is suitable for the objective and whether it actually exceeds the necessity of the problem.
So if cost-benefit analysis is about maximizing net societal benefit, a pure utilitarian goal, proportionality is focused on something different.
It's focused on minimizing disturbance. Proportionality forces policymakers to constantly prioritize the least disruptive regulatory disturbance to the free market, even if a slightly more disruptive path would yield slightly higher net economic benefits. The whole mechanism is meant to institutionalize a preference for non-intervention and minimal disruption.
So, for instance, a really burdensome intervention that produces huge benefits might still be deemed non-proportionate.
If a far less burdensome intervention could solve 80% of the problem with minimal interference to the underlying market.
Right.
Proportionality acts as a check on regulatory maximalism, ensuring the means are precisely tailored to the problem identified.
That's a crucial constraint, one the U.S. system completely lacks. Okay, let's talk about their third attempt at institutional innovation, enhance public participation and stakeholder balance. This is supposed to combat the lobbying dynamic we talked about in the U.S.
In theory, yes. The European Commission tries to promote early and highly diverse stakeholder involvement, unlike the U.S. system, where notice and comment procedures often favor big corporations who can submit these detailed, high-cost economic analyses.
So the EU tries to force balanced input from industry and from civil society organizations.
Right. The goal is to give regulators the broadest possible information base and to counter the competitive advantage of corporate groups.
But the sources we're looking at identify a major flaw in how this is executed.
A critical flaw. While it's nominally balanced, in practice, the EU process is arguably more susceptible to capture than the U.S. system. It often results in what you'd call structured capture.
What does that mean?
It means the Commission tends to consult almost exclusively with very large European companies and with influential civil society groups like powerful pan-European unions or established advocacy organizations that represent relatively narrow segments of the broader public interest.
So it leaves out the little guys. Small companies, foreign firms, newer public interest groups are all outside the loop.
Completely. The process effectively promotes market concentration by ensuring that only the largest, most entrenched European players have a meaningful seat at the table during the drafting phase.
That sounds like a textbook case of what public choice theorists call the bootleggers and Baptists phenomenon. We should probably elaborate on that.
Absolutely. It's a great way to explain regulatory capture that seems politically benign. The bootleggers are the incumbent firms, the regulated industry, who secretly want the regulation because it creates these anti-competitive barriers to entry.
And the Baptists are the well-meaning, idealistic civil society or public interest groups who provide the moral cover for the regulation. They're focused on the noble goal, like safety or the environment or digital ethics.
Precisely. And the problem in Europe is that the Commission's consultation process is designed in such a way that it only invites the largest bootleggers and the most powerful Baptists to the table.
And the result is a system where incumbents and large unions successfully collaborate to demand regulations that are high-cost, high-compliance barriers.
Which preserves the incumbents' market share, while they all get to claim a victory for social values. It's a deeply entrenched problem.
That structured capture is the total antithesis of dynamism. Okay, finally, what about their fourth strength? Comprehensive retrospective review.
The EU system, and this is exemplified by programs like REFIT, that's the Regulatory Fitness and Performance Program, it integrates a continuous look-back component into its policy-making structure. The intent is excellent. Periodically reassess the existing entire body of rules to call, modify, or strengthen regulations in response to new information or changing markets.
And that level of institutionalized comprehensiveness reviewing regulations, regardless of political will, is something sorely lacking in the United States.
Sorely lacking.
But is the execution rigorous enough?
Not really. Despite the comprehensiveness, the standards deployed by the European Commission in these fitness checks are exceedingly vague and easily manipulated by bureaucrats who are, as you saw in Brussels, often more intent on retaining the status quo than admitting a program has failed.
The documents are full of broad policy pronouncements, but they lack objective, measurable methodology.
Exactly. There's no clear way to determine if a law is the most effective mechanism for achieving a benefit with minimum cost. Now, contrast that with the U.S. system. While the U.S. rarely initiates comprehensive review, the few retrospective review efforts that are launched often rely on a much more rigorous analytical standard. They focus heavily on quantifiable costs and benefits, often required by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA.
So the optimal solution combines the EU's breadth of review, the fact that they actually look at everything, with the US's focus on objective analytical rigor. That seems like the perfect blueprint for this new proposal. So we've established the US system is broken by gridlock and inertia, and the EU system, while it has these innovative principles, fails in execution because of structured capture and vague analytical standards. We need a hybrid. Let's introduce market corrective rulemaking, or MCR. This is designed to be a unique parallel track for agency rulemaking.
Right. MCR is fundamentally about introducing what you could call regulatory experimentalism. It's about creating a system that is dynamic and self-correcting, rather than permanent and ossified. And it's designed specifically for those economic interventions targeting the classic market failures we discussed earlier.
The first pillar here is conditional delegation and the invocation of MCR. This seems to change the primary job description of Congress entirely.
It completely shifts the burden of investigation and design. Since we know Congress lacks the institutional expertise, its role is simplified. Congress just identifies the market failure, say, a specific externality in a nascent industry, and then sets the overarching policy goals.
And the massive burden of all the sophisticated analysis, the design, the modeling, that gets shifted squarely to the administrative agencies who actually have the specialists.
Right.
Okay, but this sounds like a conservative's worst nightmare, giving even more power to administrative agencies, the regulatory leviathan. How does MCR avoid granting them unbounded authority?
The delegation is meticulously modest compared to some historical U.S. precedents, like the power that was once granted to set maximum commodity prices, which courts actually upheld. Under MCR, Congress has to place strict analytical constraints on the agency.
And what are those constraints?
Congress must do two things. First, it has to clearly identify the specific market failure being targeted, and second, it must explicitly state the methodology the agency must use.
Meaning it has to define the primary goal.
Exactly. Congress has to decide. Does it prefer maximizing net economic benefits, which is the traditional utilitarian approach, or does it want to prioritize minimizing market disruption, which is the proportionality approach? This ensures the delegation is not some vague roving commission, but a targeted, analytically bounded response.
I see. So by predefining the analytical methodology, Congress maintains control over the agency's underlying philosophical framework, even if the agency is handling all the technical details.
That's the idea.
Okay, now let's look at the operational side. Once MCR is invoked, what are the procedural requirements that inject that rigor and prevent capture?
There are three non-negotiable requirements, and they blend the best of the U.S. and EU systems. First, mandated cost-benefit analysis. This is formal. Agencies have to conduct a full CBA for every MCR rule. It doesn't matter how small the rule is.
And crucially, that analysis is subjected to mandatory review by OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
Correct. It's treated as if it were a significant regulatory action, which means the technical experts at OIRA scrutinize the agency's shadow economy modeling and its attempt to quantify those abstract benefits.
And the default is to maximize net benefits.
Right. Unless the statute says otherwise, the agency is presumed to maximize net economic benefits. If the agency wants to choose an alternative, say selecting a lower benefit solution to protect small businesses, it has to provide compelling quantitative evidence, which is then reviewed by OIRA to support that deviation.
It puts objective, measurable economics at the front of every single decision.
That's the goal.
Okay, second, we incorporate that EU innovation, proportionality analysis, or tailoring. This is key to preventing the rule from becoming unnecessarily disruptive.
Right. The agency has to formally analyze the displacement of underlying market forces caused by the intervention. This forces a rigorous tailoring analysis to prove that the means chosen are not disproportionate to the underlying problem. It's not just about maximizing utility, it's about finding the least disruptive solution possible.
And that proportionality analysis serves two functions.
It does. First, it guides the agency toward market-friendly solutions like cap and trade instead of command and control. And second, and this is crucial, it creates a check for judicial review later on. It forces the agency to demonstrate that it considered and rejected less disruptive alternatives.
And finally, to address that deep-seated problem of regulatory capture, the whole bootleggers and Baptists scenario MCR requires structured stakeholder input. How is this different from the passive notice and comment procedures we have now?
It mandates active outreach. MCR requires novel, active outreach to entities that are traditionally excluded from the process. This is a direct attack on the competitive advantage enjoyed by large incumbent firms.
So the agency has to go out and find input from small businesses, foreign firms, and broad public interest groups.
Yes, not just the well-funded, entrenched lobbying organizations. The agency has to document this outreach, and the APA's requirement to properly consider the relevant matter presented is extended to this broader, more diverse input base. The whole goal is transparency.
To ensure that the final rule is not just a structured collaboration between the biggest market players and the moralizing public interest groups.
You've got it. It forces the door open to the new, smaller competitors who are usually locked out by the cost of participation.
But the most important structural innovation, the one that directly addresses the inertia in the U.S. system, has to be the retrospective review and termination.
This is the mechanism that makes regulation impermanent, conditional, and dynamic. Agencies are required to periodically reassess the rule, say, every 5 or 7 years, by essentially repeating the entire MCR procedure.
And they have to determine if the initial cost-benefit estimates were accurate, and most importantly, if the original market failure that justified the rule still persists.
That is the core question. And the power of MCR is in the implicit directive to terminate.
The conditional authority.
Conditional authority. Congress implicitly directs the agency to terminate the intervention when that reassessment shows that the original market failure no longer exists. This transforms the agency's power from a permanent, irrevocable grant into a conditional one, tied explicitly to the persistence of the market flaw.
This would have prevented some truly absurd historical failures. Let's talk about the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC.
The ICC is the quintessential example of regulatory ossification. It was established way back in 1887 to regulate the rail industry, which at the time held massive monopoly power over transport. Its main function was regulating rail rates.
But by the 1920s and 30s, the rise of the automobile, the trucking industry, and later air travel, that completely eroded the railroad's monopoly power. The underlying market failure was just gone.
It was gone. Yet the ICC survived largely unchanged until 1995. For decades, it was a regulatory corpse, actively harming the economy by imposing outdated rules on a highly competitive market, all because political inertia prevented Congress from repealing it.
And MCR is designed to make that kind of long, silent survival impossible.
Impossible. The moment the MCR looked back found that the market for transportation was no longer monopolistic, the agency would have been implicitly directed to sunset the ICC's authority.
That dynamism is incredibly appealing, but we have to address the practical friction here. Doesn't this just make every single MCR rule a target for endless high-stakes litigation? Every disgruntled firm is going to challenge the agency's proportionality analysis or its cost-benefit modeling.
That is the trade-off. The downside of regulatory dynamism is uncertainty, and uncertainty carries real economic costs. Rules adopted under MCR are intentionally more susceptible to judicial challenge than traditional rules are.
Businesses make huge investment decisions based on what they anticipate the regulatory environment will be.
Of course. And this inherent uncertainty is the price we pay for solving inertia. A private litigant, say, an industry competitor, or a public interest group can challenge the agency's MCR rule as arbitrary and capricious for failing to properly estimate costs, for failing to adequately justify the choice of intervention, or, crucially, for failing to observe the active stakeholder outreach requirements.
And they can also challenge the rule directly on proportionality grounds, arguing the means chosen were excessively disruptive and therefore violated the statutory mandate.
Exactly.
So courts would not be substituting their judgment for the agency's expertise, but they would be scrutinizing the agency's homework.
That's a perfect way to put it. The courts would still defer significantly to the agency's substantive determination that a market failure exists. However, they would scrutinize the agency's adherence to the MCR procedures. Did they conduct a rigorous CBA? Did they analyze alternatives for proportionality? Did they observe the mandated outreach to the full range of stakeholders?
This judicial scrutiny ensures the agency can't fall back into the habit of celebrating mere compliance metrics over true economic efficiency.
It forces the managerial state to remain tethered to the real world of costs and benefits, unlike your bureaucrat in Brussels. In the end, what MCR is a formal institutional attempt to break the paralysis that defines American regulation. It's borrowing the best structural ideas from Europe, comprehensiveness, CBA, and proportionality, and fusing them with American analytical rigor and judicial review. It's a necessary exercise in regulatory experimentalism.
It's a recognition that government intervention has to be conditional and temporary.
It has to be. It should be designed to correct a specific temporary flaw rather than becoming this permanent feature of the economic landscape.
And it brings us right back to that fundamental irony that drove the Brussels anecdote. In the private market, individual actors usually receive the benefit and they bear the cost of their own actions, which means market failure is generally the exception. It requires some external intervention to correct it.
Right. It's an anomaly.
However, when we look at the political market, the arena where regulation is actually designed and lobbied for and implemented, individual actors, whether they are voters, politicians, lobbyists, or bureaucrats, they almost never bear the full cost or receive the full benefit of their actions.
The costs are dispersed.
The costs are dispersed. Lobbyists procure special favors at the public's expense. Politicians take credit for expansive, transcendental policy goals without ever having to pay the modeling cost. And bureaucrats, like the ones celebrating his infographic, are allowed to celebrate compliance metrics completely disconnected from economic reality.
It's a system with no accountability.
Exactly. And therefore, market failure, which is the exception in the private economy, tends to be the rule in the political economy. That deep-seated political market failure is the core institutional challenge of our time, and it is the only reason we need sophisticated institutional design like market corrective rulemaking to keep the regulatory engine running efficiently, dynamically, and above all, rationally.